Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Howie Hawkins. I ran for president as a Green Party candidate in 2020, and these podcasts are about continuing to advance a green socialist program that this country needs more than ever. And I wish I had some good news to report this week, but started out bad. We got this very grim report from the International Panel on Climate Change, which is a pretty conservative body. They have to get 194 nations to approve the wording. And that includes petrostates like Saudi Arabia, Russia, the United States, and so forth. But despite that, it basically said what we can all see. The climate crisis is upon us. It's not coming. It can get worse. And we got to, take serious action. So within hours of that report being released, first thing Biden does is appoint as senior advisor for energy security to the State Department an oil and gas man. This guy's particularly big on natural gas. He goes back to the Obama administration. He's been in industry in between. And, some of these environmentalists used to say that natural gas was the bridge to the renewable future. We replace coal with gas and then we get the renewables. And this guy used to say when they talked about that, a bridge is a two-way street and we're going to have natural gas basically forever. That's where this guy's coming from. So within hours of this report, that's who Biden appoints as senior advisor for energy security at the State Department. And, you can go look it up. American Prospect had a good article on this week. The Biden administration is full of oil and gas people. So you can see that in the bipartisan infrastructure bill and we don't have the details yet on the reconciliation package, but we do know what they used to call the Clean Energy Standard. Now it's called the Clean Energy Payment Program. So instead of telling utilities you got to meet a clean energy standard by a certain date, now we're going to pay them to do it. A lot of states already have this kind of thing. And in that standard is carbon capture and sequestration. They call it low carbon, so gas can qualify in a lot of circumstances. Garbage incinerators, nuclear power, a lot of money in this bipartisan bill to bail out the nuclear industry, which is failing. That money should go into renewables. So that was Monday. Then Tuesday, a Republican put in they had what they call a vote-a-rama, and they did these non-binding resolutions to the budget resolution, which kind of set the financial framework for the reconciliation bill. And the Senate voted 99-0. That means all the Democrats against there ever being a federal Green New Deal. And Bernie Sanders said, well, it had nothing to do with the Green New Deal because it was a non-binding resolution. But what you see what's happening here, and I'm going to go through a bunch of these, the Democrats are agreeing with the Republicans ideologically. They're not fighting them on that. And between all the lobbyists that push industry positions, the Democrats are conceding the ground. So that was Tuesday. Wednesday, they went to other things like a resolution to penalize local government that defunds the police. You may have heard Cory Booker get all on his high horse and say, yeah, everybody's going to vote for this along with Mother, the flag, and apple pie. But the point is, if a local government decides they won't put money into people that can handle mental health crises or housing for the homeless, and they take it out of the police department, this resolution says they can be penalized by the federal government in terms of whatever funding they're providing the police or the local government. And then they also voted to hire 100,000 new police officers. 95 senators voted for that. That means almost all the Democrats. I think there were 3 that voted against. They were Democrats. So, that's Biden's old, COPS program from 1994 crime bill that everybody was so upset about during the presidential campaign and what it meant for mass incarceration. Here they are repeating that, and all the Democrats, except a few of them, are getting right on line with that. And then again on Wednesday, they voted 88-11, which means most of the Democrats, to say that no immigrants that test positive for COVID can be removed from the border, once they're crossing in detention. And those detention sites are incubators petri dishes for COVID. And this plays right into the Republican myth that these idiots like Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, and DeSantis, the governor of Florida, are saying, we've got this spike in COVID now because of immigrants, not because people aren't getting the vaccination. So the Democrats played into all this. Now, they're non-binding resolutions, but these are always used for campaign messaging. So the Democrats just box themselves into a position where they can't even argue against the Democratic positions. They're conceding the debate. And I've been seeing this, for 40 years. Neoliberalism really started under Carter, but it got accelerated under Reagan. And I remember the Democrats being so proud of themselves for voting for the Reagan tax cuts and shepherded them through majority Democratic House and supporting the military buildup that Reagan did and the social program cuts. And, the Democrats think, well, if we take the Republican positions, we co-opt the edge they have against us. Of course, what they're doing is just conceding the whole field to that point of view. So that's only Wednesday. Thursday, the census data was released. And, the general picture is the country's more diverse than it was 10 years ago, more people of color. The percentage of white people has declined for the first time in any census. But we have to understand that this census probably undercounted people of color, because we know that the guy that was head of the Commerce Department, Wilbur Ross, corporate criminal, robo-signing king, stole people's homes. He was trying to obstruct it. So that was on the 12th. And the Republicans are now busy doing their gerrymandering in the 30 state legislatures they control. And they're drawing maps to lock themselves into power in the House and the state legislatures for the next decade. And this is going to be over in weeks in a lot of states, in most of the states by the end of the year. And the senators left on vacation Friday. Now, what happened on Friday was Schumer brought up another token vote for the For the People Act, which would ban partisan gerrymandering, but it wasn't going to pass because they didn't deal with the filibuster. So they were just posturing. And then they went on vacation. And again, I can remember back to the 1980s. Jesse Jackson was the liberal running for president, and he kept telling the Democratic Party, you better pay attention to redistricting coming up in 1990, because the Republicans are getting ready to mess with you. And they've done it now. This will be the fourth decade in a row. This has been a long-term Republican strategy. And the Democrats know it's coming. They've been screwed by it. And they can't find a way to stop it because a few of them think the filibuster is the end. So you got states like Pennsylvania has 18 representatives in the House. The Democrats always get a majority of the vote statewide for Democratic congressional candidates. But in the last decade, only 5 of those 18 seats have been held by Democrats because of this partisan gerrymandering. They pack the Democrats, concentrate them in certain districts so the Republicans can control all the rest. In Wisconsin, they did the same thing. In the state legislature, for example, in 2018, the Democrats won 53% of the assembly votes statewide, but they only got 36% of the seats. And they are doing this now in the 30 states where the Republicans control both legislatures because they've been gerrymandering now for decades. And we've had a couple of Supreme Court decisions. You can't challenge this in the courts because the Supreme Court said partisan gerrymandering is constitutional. So along with the voter suppression, the election subversion, we now got 9 states where they've changed election administration from nominally independent bodies to partisan bodies, usually Republican-controlled legislatures. They can steal elections, and they'll do it because they got the power and they got no moral compunctions. And they're also out there. There's violent intimidation of election workers. So a lot of these election administrators are quitting. This is the kind of stuff that happened when the Klan mobilized a violent takeover of the Reconstruction governments back after the Civil War in the 1870s. And, one of the frustrating things for me, there's a lot of commentary on the liberal corporate media, CNN, MSNBC, and all these so-called smart people. I haven't seen one of them say, the way to get rid of gerrymandering and have full and fair representation of all political viewpoints is proportional representation. I mean, all they can imagine is some kind of nonpartisan redistricting, and you're still going to end up with one of the two major parties being the majority in those districts. They will monopolize the power. Most of the elections will not be competitive. We have, like in the House right now, 90% of the seats are one-party districts. They're not competitive. And that remains the same. Laney Guinier objected back in the 80s when there was a debate on how do you remedy the institutional racial bias of single-member districts. And what the mainstream civil rights movement pushed and won with the Democratic Party support is majority-minority districts. And Laney Guinier, who was with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, was writing law articles saying, what you're doing is setting a ceiling on Black power because there are only so many minority-majority districts you can write. You're making Black people in majority-white districts powerless because they're a smaller minority because they pack Black people into these majority-minority districts. Within those majority-minority districts, given winner take all, the incumbent Black politician is shielded from competition because of the spoiler problem. People don't want to split the Black vote. And she pointed all these things out, and she said it was precluding a progressive coalition across racial lines. Made a lot of good arguments. And I think she ended up at Harvard, and then Clinton appointed her to be the assistant attorney general for civil rights until the Wall Street Journal labeled her the quota queen. She was actually the opposite. She was saying these majority minority districts were setting a quota ceiling on Black representation and power. But Bill Clinton, who didn't have a backbone anywhere in his body, dropped her like a hot potato. And so she never even got to defend her positions in hearings. She got smeared and just wiped off, out of the debate back then. So I listened to all this debate, and at least you think you'd have somebody, some damn law professor or political scientist that they bring on these programs and say, there's another way to deal with this. It's better. That renders partisan gerrymandering impossible, and that's proportional representation. When you have multi-member districts, with single-member districts, you can draw the lines to have political, partisan, and racial bias. You have multi-member districts, every political viewpoint gets its fair share of representation. District lines really don't matter. But that's just off the debate, out of the discussion. The only place you're going to hear it from is the Green Party. And another thing went on this week was Afghanistan. And people are surprised that the government that we propped up, which everybody knew was crooked, most of the money, a lot of the money that we gave them for this supposedly big armed force and weaponry ended up in bank accounts in Dubai and places like that. And, the tops in that government, if they're not out of the country yet, they will be shortly because that's what they're in it for. So it's not surprising that ordinary Afghans who got in the military partly just to get a paycheck are saying, hey, I don't have the backing even of my own government. I'm out of here. And they've totally collapsed. And we knew that from what was called the Afghanistan papers, the Washington Post published. These were internal documents, kind of like the Pentagon papers that Daniel Ellsberg released, that showed that the generals and the people that were administering our war in Afghanistan were painting a rosy picture like the generals did in Vietnam. And they knew better. And the politicians bought it. But we were arrogant. Afghanistan's been the graveyard of empires for over 1,000 years. And so what do we do now? I mean, obviously the Taliban is a totally reactionary religious fundamentalist force. It's going to be terrible for women, terrible for anybody that work with the government or with Western aid agencies. I mean, the best thing the U.S. can do is open this country up for their asylum. And we don't have logistics to get all the people that probably deserve it out. We should maximize that while our forces are there in Kabul, getting the diplomatic corps out, and the people that, you know, were closest to us and the translators and so forth. But there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of Afghans that could be targeted by the Taliban. And a lot of them are going to be fleeing for the borders. And this country owes them the right to live because we set them up in this situation. Not that we're going to do it. You know, we're going to provide some asylum for a certain number, but it's going to be a fraction of what's needed. And so, you know, we can condemn the Taliban for what they're doing, but we should condemn our government for not providing the assistance to those Afghans that are going to be victims of the Taliban. And another thing happened this week is Andrew Cuomo resigned. And having run against him 3 times, you know, all I can say is good riddance. What took so long? He's always been a bully. I mean, not just not only with respect to sexual harassment and assault that's been alleged, but we saw that the way he ran state government for a decade. And the so-called liberal left, democratic socialist left in this country, in this state, always put him on the ballot line. He's on the Working Families ballot line. They did primary him finally in 2018. They lost and immediately put him on the ballot, and people like AOC immediately endorsed him on CNN within days of Cynthia Nixon losing the primary. But I will also say that Cuomo's just a symptom of the misogynistic political culture. Albany state legislature and, you know, the Albany government is notorious for being a den of sexual harassment for interns and young female staff. And while they've cleaned some of that up, I doubt it's completely gone. And meanwhile, one of the worst legacies of Cuomo is this draconian ballot access law that we face in New York. And, you know, this is the Democrats' version of voter suppression. Party suppression is a form of voter suppression. You know, I'd like to point out there was an exit poll in 2016 that said 61% of Jill Stein's voters would not have voted, stayed home if she had not been on the ballot. You plug those numbers into Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, it wouldn't have changed the outcome, although Jill gets blamed for spoiling the election. The facts just don't support that. So, you know, we've been basically eliminated from the ballot in New York. We have to get basically 90,000 signatures in 42 days next April and May. Probably costs us, if we can raise the money, $200,000 to pay the petitioners to get that done. And then we got to get 2% of the vote. In 2020, that was 174,000 votes. Maybe the off year, it'll be 150,000 votes. It used to be 50,000. So they basically tripled the vote we got to get. And if we don't do that, then whoever our presidential candidate is in 2024, if they want to be on the New York ballot, they're going to have to cough up $200,000 to get a petition drive done. That's the legacy of Andrew Cuomo and all the Democrats that enabled him and his reactionary policies. We have a state where the Democrats have a supermajority in both chambers of the state legislature. And they always said, well, when we get both chambers and a governor, we'll pass single-payer health care. Well, they've had that since 2018. And the assembly used to pass single-payer every year. Now it can't get out of committee. And there are other, you know, progressive legislation like that. So Andrew Cuomo was a bad guy, but he's a symptom of a deeper problem and an expression of what the Democratic Party really is. You know, he is funding, as it is for the Democratic Party as a whole, is Wall Street, real estate, health insurance companies, oil and gas companies, and they get what they pay for. And I'm going on, but I'll make one more point. This COVID situation, we had 186,000 new cases yesterday. You have to go back to the peak of the highest wave we had last January to find that many cases. And that was before we had vaccinations. So we're in a very serious situation. And we got these dummies like DeSantis and Abbott trying to prevent schools from requiring their kids to wear masks. They're just setting up little children to get sick with COVID and some of them to die. And it's not about freedom. Give me a damn break. It's about pandering to the Trump base, which has just lost its mind, lost touch with reality. These people will say there's no COVID until they're sick and dying from it. And even then they'll go to their grave thinking it was something else. They think, Trump won the election. Yesterday, the pillow guy was saying, he's got the proof and, the Supreme Court will approve it. And, Trump should be president today, according to the pillow guy. But when you're in a cult, you miss the deadline, they got another deadline for you. So I guess go back to the first thing. The Republicans are obvious idiots, obviously immoral. So why the hell are the Democrats voting with them on these resolutions in the vote-a-rama this week and basically conceding the argument to these idiots? With Democrats like that, who needs Republicans? So anyway, that's all I got. I'll take some questions. Eric Gray, in your opinion, Howie, how can authentic leftists defeat these right-wing governors like Abbott and DeSantis? Well, we've got to start pushing for ranked choice voting, particularly multi-member ranked choice voting to get proportional representation. We got to build that from the bottom up, start doing it in cities and counties to the point where we can get it at the state level. And that's how the left, the Greens, will get a foothold in government and have a more legitimate platform than we got now, because we're really on the margins, on the outside, and the mainstream media, because we're not the city council rep or the state legislature or the member of Congress. We don't get a lot of coverage. Our ideas don't get out there. So I think that's the way we get a foothold. If we keep trying to win within this winner-take-all single-member district system, the spoiler problem and the winner-take-all districts, it just set up to marginalize us. So I think that's number one. That's what we got to work on. And then the other thing is we got to call the Democrats out for the kind of crap they pulled this week in the Senate. Let's stop pretending the Democrats were going to defeat this right-wing, craziness with, the Democrats' neoliberalism. Because, not even willing to fight the Republicans on their stupidities. So, that was one of the things that frustrated me in the presidential election. All the progressive, prominent pundits, were attacking me and Angela for daring to run when everybody supposedly needed to vote for Biden because that was the only way we were going to defeat Trump. And I kept trying to point out to them, Trump is a symptom of Trumpism. And it's a right-wing politics. It's a racist politics. It goes back to the Redeemers and the Klan, overthrowing of the Reconstruction governments, or before that, splitting and forming a Confederacy when Lincoln got elected, down to their resistance during the Jim Crow era when they had the power to where they are today. That's the same politics. And you're not going to defeat that by accommodating them, which is what the Democrats try to do. That's what the Democrats have done historically. The New Deal coalition was Northern liberals and Southern racists. And so, Black people and other people of color in the Southwest, for example, the first Social Security bill left out agricultural workers. Well, that meant Mexican farm workers in the Southwest, as well as Black farm workers, and actually white farm workers in, from Texas over to Florida. They didn't get Social Security. One of the ironies of a lot of these Jim Crow laws, like the poll tax and the literacy tests, was that they disenfranchised poor whites as well as almost all Blacks. And So there's a basis for a coalition there. William Barber is pretty good on making that point. He says this is not just a race issue, it's a class issue. And the people pushing this racial divide, voter suppression, are doing it because they're greedy, because they don't want ordinary people to unite against the priorities of the greedy and the wealthy. And, that's the kind of coalition we need to build. That's what King was trying to do. And I give, Barber props for articulating that well. And so, we got to build that coalition, but, don't let the Democrats co-opt it. Otherwise, they're going to be, the tail on the Democratic donkey. And the donkey's going to wag the tail, not the other way around. Amy L. Sachs. I don't know why so-called lefties are so quick to trust Dems like Cynthia Nixon, Bernie Sanders, etc., who freeze out and denigrate Green Party. Cowardice is a bad look for a candidate who claims they'll fight for you. Can't argue with that. I mean, I've been fighting that since the Democrats told the Freedom Democrats from Mississippi they weren't going to be seated in '64, then escalated in Vietnam, right down to when I was about to retire, and George Miller, who was one of the founders of the Progressive Caucus, a Democrat from Richmond in Concord, California, was the Democratic sponsor of a bill called the Multi-Employer Pension Reform Act, which took away our protections under the ERISA, Employer Retirement Income Security Act, which said our promised benefits could not be taken from us. Well, that was attached to omnibus spending bill, voted on by a voice vote in the middle of the night. So my pension was cut 20%. It's been my experience of the Democratic Party. I'm bookending it because I can give you about 40, 50 years in between where the Democrats, when you get down to these fights, whether it's nuclear power or war, affordable housing, you name it, Democrats are on the other side. And the liberals, like Nixon and Sanders and people like that, I think they freeze out the Greens because we're their guilty conscience. They know we're right, and they don't want us to make them look bad. So they don't want us to have a platform. Garrett Brown, Howie, how much worse do you think COVID will have to get for the socialist governments to close schools or mandate distancing and other measures? I don't know how much worse. DeSantis did walk back a little bit yesterday because he realized he threatened to take away the salaries of school board members and superintendents who imposed a mask mandate in their school districts. And DeSantis doesn't have that power. So he admitted he doesn't have that power. But I don't know. I mean, I just don't know how much worse it can get because it's so bad. And, I maybe if a lot of kids start dying because, just starting to go back to school. I mean, some of these Florida districts, they tested the kids and hundreds of them have been quarantined because they're positive. And they hadn't even got, hanging out with each other in school. So I'm really fearful that the kids, you're talking about children under 12 who can't get the vaccine. And these damn governors are saying, I don't care if you wear a mask or not. They don't care about people. So, I don't know if they got a conscience. So I don't know how much worse it could get before they find their conscience. Soulless governors, you're right. They don't have a soul. Green Party of Kings County. That must be up in Washington. We got a Kings County. That's Brooklyn, but that logo's too green for Brooklyn. Howie, much your thoughts on the Hoover Dam? Love it, hate it, what? Those big dam projects, I think of Glen Canyon, which is now dried up. As a elementary school kid, I got pulled into the Sierra Club by a music teacher at my elementary school. And, Glen Dam was being built and it destroyed a beautiful canyon. And now it's reappearing because there's not enough water. So, what I like about Hoover Dam, it was a public works project in the Great Depression, put a lot of people to work. But in terms of the environment, could have been better thought through. And in terms of planning land use to build these mega cities in deserts, essentially, like Las Vegas and Phoenix and Los Angeles, that's not sustainable. So those are my thoughts on Hoover Dam. Scout Trooper 164. Howie, what can be done to ensure people in Pennsylvania are aware that the Greens aren't spoilers and didn't write signatures twice to get on a PA ballot? Is that something that the Democrats are saying about us? They never questioned our signatures. The reason we got knocked off the ballot is somebody who was standing in for Angela Walker, I think they faxed in their form instead of mailing it. So the state had the right information. They just didn't have it the way they wanted it. And the Democrats challenged that. And as it went through the courts, all the Democrats voted to knock us off. All the Republicans voted to keep us on for their own reasons, thinking we're going to take votes from the Democrats. I think we've got to admit that when it's single member plurality districts, the spoiler problem is real. I mean, some Greens think, well, we just don't talk about that. But we can't just ignore that. People understand that. You know, when they had to decide if they're a progressive, whether to vote for me and Angela or Biden to stop Trump, they face that. So we have to face that. And that means we got to push ranked choice voting for single seat offices for executive branch and multi-seat ranked choice voting to get proportional representation in the legislative bodies. Well, I missed that. Scout Trooper said, I'm curious if you can put that back up. They said our signatures were written more than one. They being, I assume, the Democrats. But they were full of shit because they didn't want the Greens on the ballot. Simple as that. Oh, yeah. Democrats lie. I mean, they're as good as the Republicans at telling big lies when it comes to ballot access. And, you know, we can go into Wisconsin. You know, what hasn't got enough attention is what they did in Montana. We had people sign a petition. And then months later, after the Greens had already run their primaries, Democratic operatives went around in one district, because you had to have a distribution requirement, to knock off enough signatures so that we'd be below the requirement in that one, I think it was in the state assembly district. So they harassed people that signed, and they told them to send an email into the Board of Election withdrawing their signature. Now, when you sign a petition, it's like an affidavit. It's your signature. There's often a witness that signs as well. That's a legal document. These people are just sending emails, and the Board of Elections is saying, okay, we'll take you off. And then the Democrats said, we don't have enough signatures anymore. So even after our people had run in primaries, they kicked us off the ballot. And again, that's a case. See, that's where the Democrats were doing the intimidation. They weren't intimidating election workers like some of these Trumpies. They're intimidating signers of petitions, harassing them. Some people just sent the email to get these people off their front door or stop phoning them. And then, you know, the courts in Montana was the same thing. Democrats voted to kick us off. Republicans voted to keep us on. And the law and the facts didn't matter. It was purely partisan hackery. Good morning, Howie. I'm in Florida, and I've been really considering registering for the Green Party. What do you think could be done to gather support for Greens down here? Well, I think, as they used to say, all politics is local. You build a base by building it locally. You know, we're not going to build this through social media and going viral. That's ephemeral. You got to get active people in communities that are committed to the party and building it and doing the work on a regular basis. So we got to get engaged in local issues. We got to go out and talk to people, knock on their doors and listen, not just preach at them. So we gain their trust and find out what people are really thinking. And then, you know, do that on a year-round basis. Then begin running local candidates, getting them into office, being, you know, people that do a good job there. And then from there, you can take on the state issues and run people for the House of Representatives. I think that's it. We got to build it from the bottom up. And, to gather support, you got to be relevant to people. So you need to be active between elections as well as during them. And you got to be talking to people. When you go out and talk to people and get a list, send them a bulletin every month about what you're doing. It doesn't have to be complicated. But the fact that you care enough about them to let them know what you're doing matters to people. You're paying attention to them. And so those are some of the things I would suggest. But it's mainly, get rooted, build a strong local, get a program of activities going, and address the issues of concern in your community, which, I know in Florida, COVID's a big one right now. I'm sure housing will be, this eviction moratorium is running out. The money for tenants and landlords has not been distributed. I think in Florida, just like the unemployment insurance, it's been slow getting out. I mean, right there, you got an issue. I don't know who's protesting that in Florida, but the Greens ought to be doing it if nobody else is, or joining those who are. I mean, there are always plenty of issues. So I think, what you find out you should prioritize is when you go out and do that canvassing, that where you go out and listen and build relationships with people. Lucre denouncer. Have you heard of liquid democracy, and do you think it's a good idea? You asked me that before, and I wrote it down, and I meant to look it up, but I haven't. So I still don't know what liquid democracy is. So I'm going to write it down again, and I'm going to find out, and then maybe I'll answer your question next time. Scout Trooper 164. Why did Dario Hunter try to paint the Greens as corrupt people? I can't read people's minds. I'll tell you my honest impression from the start was this guy had just joined the Greens 6 months before he decided he wanted to run for president. He was on a school board. He got on through a write-in because nobody else wanted to run for the seat. And then when it came up for re-election, there was 5 people for 4 seats. He was an incumbent, and he lost. I know in criticizing my positions, he misrepresented them consistently and knew better. So he struck me as, an ambitious opportunist. And his judgment, because painting the Greens as corrupt, he got that from Sedinam out there in California, that's what she does. She says, I'm excluded from this event or that event. The Greens are corrupt. She'll even say that when she's included. So the fact that he got in with her right at the beginning told me he didn't have a good read on people. So why? I think it was a naive way of trying to advance his prospects. But, if you're trying to get the Greens votes and you're telling them they're corrupt and they know better, like they're saying your state's primary is corrupt, and the Greens in that state, well, no, we're not. In most cases, they were not. It's just not a good political strategy. So anyway, that's the best I can explain it. Eric Gray, any advice for teachers and students in the midst of this pandemic, given the stupidity of these right-wing governors? Well, wear your masks. I would say get organized to deal with bullying. I was thinking about that doctor. You've probably all seen the video of these people harassing them out in the parking lot. I mean, my thought was I'd just go like this at them. That might irritate them more, but I don't know what you do with people that are like that. But I would not be intimidated by people that, make remarks about you wearing a mask. If you're a man, they'll challenge your masculinity. You can't let that get to you. And, you should probably be organized to respond. Certainly the teachers need to talk to their students about how to deal with that if it comes up. And it may not just be other students that are bullying and harassing them. It may be their parents or just, people of this right-wing movement against vaccines and masks. So I think that's one thing, be organized to respond, not just to the governors, but the movement on the streets. Because if we don't counter the fascists there, they're going to control the streets. And then we're really in trouble. And they're trying to control the schools. So I think we got to be organized to respond to that. And the governors, I think we just need to say, they're immoral idiots. Matthew Sinnock. Any chance Congress addresses Green New Deal during Biden presidency or not likely? Well, you heard, excuse me. You heard what I said at the beginning, or maybe not, but the senators voted 99-0 on Tuesday for a Republican resolution that said the federal government cannot implement a Green New Deal. And that included even the advocates of the Green New Deal, like Markey and Sanders. So that doesn't look good, for them to put forward a Green New Deal. Now, people like Sanders and Markey will say, well, elements of our Green New Deal are in the reconciliation package. And I'm looking forward to the numbers, because when I did an analysis of Biden's jobs plan, which was his climate plan, and a whole lot of other stuff, it was really about $100 billion a year over 8 years going into climate out of a $2.3 trillion 8-year program, or about a third of it, $800 billion out of $2.3 trillion. And it looks like it's been pared down even more. You look at the summaries we're getting from Sanders on the Budget Committee and news reports, and it's just a list of items, tuition-free community college, universal pre-K, extending the child credit, programs like that, and then some climate change provisions. They're not specified. The one thing we do know is Tina Smith out of Minnesota seems to be the lead on converting this clean energy standard to the clean energy payment program, which I described earlier. And Tina Smith makes clear we're going to be paying for so-called low carbon natural gas, waste incinerators, nuclear power, as well as, the real clean renewables like solar and wind. So we'll see what they come up with, but that's not a Green New Deal. I mean, the Green New Deal, as I've articulated since I was the first politician in this country to put it forward in 2010, it is a program for economic and environmental justice. So it has an economic bill of rights for jobs, income, housing, healthcare, education, and a secure retirement, and a economy conversion program to get to 100% clean energy and zero emissions in a decade. And what we got now, at its best, the Biden program is kind of Keynesian, prime the pump spending, including climate spending. It's inadequate to get, he said he's going to cut carbon emissions by 50% by 2030. He just pulled that out of his rear end. In fact, he said 50 to 52%, but didn't provide any justification why there was that 2% margin. That's just politicians lying. And there's an article I wrote called Biden's Climate Pledge is a Promise He Cannot Keep. Almost 10,000 words goes into this in detail. And so, piece of that might be element of the Green New Deal, but what they are doing is it's all, changing market rules with incentives, tax breaks, rebates, subsidies, and contracts for corporate America. So it's at the leisurely pace the market can make profit at it. It's not coordinated between the different sectors like transportation and housing. You want to build walkable communities, you got to link mass transit in the cities to expanded public housing to create these walkable communities. That's just one example. The manufacturing sector, that's really key, and they really don't address it. You've got to have a steel industry that doesn't use coke ovens, and a cement industry that isn't putting basically limestone to harden the cement, and that's a carbonate and the calcium. The calcium hardens the cement. The carbon evaporates in the atmosphere. Depending on how you calculate it, it's 5 to 8% of the world's carbon footprint. There's nothing in any of these programs that they're talking about in Washington that addresses those two industries among many that need to be totally transformed. So some of us, very few of us, are saying we got to go beyond the Keynesian Green New Deal. That is how Markey and AOC, Bernie Sanders, have put it into legislation in Congress. And we got to go to an eco-socialist approach that draws on what we did during World War II when the federal government took over a quarter of the manufacturing capacity of the country in order to turn industry on a dime to build arsenal of democracy to defeat the fascists. And they owned and planned that sector of the economy. And we need to do nothing less to deal with this climate crisis. And frankly, besides our eco-socialist Green New Deal, I was actually writing another article and looking for who else has said this. Not just in general. There are lots of academic eco-socialists out there, but who has done it as a specific critique of what Biden has put forward and what the liberal progressive Democrats, there's a Green New Deal network of a lot of the liberal environmental groups, the Working Families Party, one of the unions, and all they want to do is spend more on what Biden's already doing. They were calling for 10 trillion over 10 years. Well, they're not going to get close to that if this full $3.5 trillion package goes forward, because we don't know what percentage of that $3.5 trillion is going to be for climate, but it looks like, because the reconciliation package combines Biden's American Jobs Plan, American Families Plan. So you're getting a lot of the social infrastructure. How much of that physical infrastructure is going to be for climate remains to be seen, because we don't have the details. So, those are your, liberal groups that are just accepting the framework, this Keynesian framework. The only person I can find that has specifically criticized Biden from a eco-socialist point of view is Kate Aronoff, who's writing for the New Republic right now. And she had an article last week, something, the title was something, you can't play nice with fossil fuel industry, and, called for, planning the transition. And, in other writings, she's called for, public ownership of the key sectors. So, but aside from her, I don't see any writers out there, any, thinkers criticizing Biden from the left. Mostly what they're doing is saying you got to spend more, not that you need to approach it differently. I mean, for example, Biden is putting the most money of anything into swapping out internal combustion engines for electric vehicles without really addressing the fact that we need to reduce vehicle traffic, both personal vehicles and trucks for freight, and get that on the mass transit rails for people and high-speed rails between cities for people and freight rails, electrified. And if you go just try to replace all the internal combustion engines we got with electric vehicles, you got a problem with rare earth minerals like cobalt and lithium, and not so rare but important minerals like copper, to build that infrastructure out, which has real environmental impacts, real impacts on the global south where a lot of these resources are located. And we have still a imperialist system where these countries are dominated by these big global corporations. So there are a lot of reasons to want to minimize the amount of mining you got to do to build this new system. So that means we want mass transit, walkable communities, and get a lot of the freight off the roads and onto the rails. That's not in the plan. And then you actually look at the numbers. This goes back to the Biden jobs plan, and he said we're going to we're going to build 500,000 public charging stations for electric vehicles. I guess over the 8 years he was projecting. But then you look to build enough charging stations for the vehicles we have now, and if they became electric, you need 8 million public charging stations and 100 million home charging stations. So what he proposed is just a drop in the bucket. And then he won't even put a date on when the conversion has to happen by. GM, state of California, state of Massachusetts have all said 2035. Biden won't say that. So any chance Congress addresses the Green New Deal during the Biden presidency? Not likely, I'm afraid. Kevin Kopic, what's the difference between democratic socialism and green socialism? Well, I think we're democratic socialists. Green means we take account of the ecological considerations. So historically, socialism, democratic socialism included, was trying to solve the scarcity problem. Working people, poor people just didn't have enough, so you wanted to produce more. And the argument was socialism was more efficient at doing that than capitalism. And then we would deliver the goods to people. Today, we have a technology that is more than productive enough to provide everybody with their basic needs. So we got to have a socialism which can plan for everybody's basic needs to be met within ecological limits. And you can't do that when the market is dictating investment and production decisions. You need to bring the ecological decisions into the planning process. So I think that's what green or ecological socialism brings to the tradition of socialism. And given where we are, not just with the climate, but we have a whole lot of serious environmental problems where we've bypassed what they call planetary boundaries of sustainability. Whether it's plastics, ocean acidification, disrupting some of the mineral cycles, mass extinctions, biodiversity destruction, ecosystem collapse, which means agriculture has a hard time surviving. We have a whole bunch of things we got to deal with. So that's why we need a green socialism. Howie, how is Angela? Is she coming back? Angela's doing good. I just got a text message from her today. I was concerned about something, and she sent a message back reassuring me. So I feel good about that. It's construction season. She's working like 12, 14 hours a day. So she's just trying to get through this hot summer. And, I think the other thing people got to realize, when you run for public office, you're going to be a target. Angela doesn't like being a target. So, she put herself out there for us. And I think we got to thank her for what she did. And she'll keep speaking up when she feels the time is right. She wants me to let her know when I'd like her to make a statement. So she's still involved. As far as these podcasts, she wanted to step back from these. She just, needs time to recover. If she's not working today, she works often 6 days a week, 80-hour weeks. She needs time to recover, wash her clothes, clean up the house, take care of her dogs, all that stuff. So Angela's doing good. And I don't know if coming back is the right word. She's still with us. She's just being involved in a different way now. Scout Trooper 164. What can be done to have the Bible Belt break their grip from the GOP and think not only for themselves, but how religion could bring them different ideals? Well, first thing we have to understand is the Bible Belt is not all Christian fundamentalists. There are a lot of people there that don't buy that whole ideology. And the Democrats aren't talking to them. The Republicans certainly aren't. So the Greens should be. And, you can draw on any religious tradition. In this case, we're talking about Christianity. To underscore values that we're talking about. So, we have a tendency sometimes to demonize our opponents, and Christianity is a religion of forgiveness and redemption. So even the Bible Belt fundamentalists, we got to leave the door open for them, because a lot of times they do change. Young people when they come into adulthood, older people when they finally realize that what they've been supporting really isn't very moral or Christian. So I think you want to have respectful dialogue with it wherever it's possible, and at least neutralize or put doubts into the fundamentalists, and also talk to the people who aren't into that mentality but live in that region. And just look at the difference between Black Baptists and white Baptists in the South and where they are politically. Black Baptists are pretty conservative on some social issues, on economic class issues, on civil rights, very different than the white Baptists. So, and they have basically the same, view of the Bible as, God's word, literally. So, there's always room for dialogue. That's what I would say. And the main thing is we got to be talking to people. And, you can have your religion and then you're getting evicted because you can't pay the rent. Or you're skipping meals because you don't have enough money in your pay packet. That's an issue you can talk to people about without getting into religion. So I think there are plenty of opportunities. You just got to find a way to start where people are at and find the common ground and work from there. So we've come upon 1 hour, and I got an assignment. Got to look up liquid democracy. And I wish I had some good news this week, but it was pretty dismal. Started with that climate report, then the Democrats agreeing all the Republican messaging and the vote-a-rama, those non-binding resolutions, basically conceding the ground on immigration and the Green New Deal and police funding. So I guess what the positive news is, there's a vacuum the Green Party needs to fill. And now that this, Biden-Trump election is over, it's a good time for us to double down on our local organizing, get our ducks lined up in our locals, and start running some good candidates and building the base. 2022 and 2024 are still going to be tough because we're running against Trumpism, even if Trump isn't on the ticket in 22. And he may be on the ticket in 24. Although, given all the legal stuff he could be facing, I still find that hard to imagine. But on the other hand, the way these rich, powerful people get away with crimes. I mentioned Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary, Trump's Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, same thing. And then you see the ties, the staff of Kamala Harris, when she was Attorney General of California, gave her over 1,000 possible indictments of Steve Mnuchin for predatory lending and civil rights violations in the way they were, foreclosing. He was involved in robo signing too. In California, she declined to prosecute. Mnuchin then turned around and gave her, I think it was $1,000 for a run for U.S. Senate. Trump gave her, I think, $2,000, and Ivanka, I think, $3,000, something like that. So you begin to realize these elites, while they look like they're fighting, when it comes to being in power and staying in power, they work with each other. And again, that's why we need an alternative. So I think the good news is there's a political vacuum we can fill, and we got to go out and do that. So thanks for listening, and see you next week.